Do you remember where the wise man built his house? Would you buy a house that didn't have a foundation? Today, in our 7-minute in the parables, we're going to talk about what might be Jesus' most well-known parable. That's the parable of the wise and the foolish builder. And it's so well-loved because it caps off the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Are you ready? This is Biblically Speaking. This book will change your life. You just got to read it. All right. Thank you for sticking around. Today, in our 7 minutes in the parables, about the same time it takes you to order a cup of coffee, we're going to be doing the parable of the wise and foolish builder. So my Bible is open to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, we're at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to try to open up some of these deep truths that are part of this parable that begins in verse 24. And we are starting our clock now. So this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has gone through the Beatitudes. He's gone through the incorrect way that the people have been taught the law. He's warned about hypocrisy and the love of money. And he began the wind-up action for the sermon at the end of Matthew chapter 6. And when you get to the end of 7, it says in verse 24, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rains fell, and the floods came and beat on the house, yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now, this is such a well-loved parable because for most of us, this is probably the first parable of Jesus that we've learned. Probably way before we even knew what a parable was, either our parents or maybe sitting in a Bible class, we remember the song, "The Wise Man Built His House Upon the Rock." But the question we're going to try to answer today in our 7 minutes is, what constitutes a wise man? Well, Jesus says it's the one who hears these sayings of mine and does them. Now, I like the idea that these are sayings of Jesus. That means we're probably dealing with the part of the Sermon on the Mount where it's a little bit at the end like the book of Proverbs, where Jesus isn't teaching a long theme. He's touching on issues that he's wanting to cover right there at the end. That's not to say that the whole Sermon on the Mount doesn't apply. But I really think at this point, Jesus is probably hyper-focused on the things that he's saying at the end of this sermon. And so what I think about when I think about the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, it's sort of the falling action that happens after Jesus gives that long discourse on the danger of loving money and this world's goods. And you reach Matthew chapter 6, and you're at the end of that chapter. And he talks about God clothing the grass of the field that's alive today as tomorrow's thrown into the oven. And it says in verse 31, "Do not worry then, saying, what will you eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek these things." This is what occupies the minds of the Gentiles. This isn't what occupies the minds of the people of God. "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." He immediately goes into Matthew 7. I'm going to put a link to a video I did on Matthew 7 right over here in the cards that's about the way that we use this passage about not using judgment. Because at the beginning of Matthew 7, he immediately pivots and says, how are you going to apply the things that I've been teaching you? And starts talking to them about using righteous judgment. Again, check out that video. But it says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take out the log of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So you have this discussion over how are you going to use the things that I've taught you already? Are you going to apply them to yourself first and make corrections so that you become that person that looks like the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount? Or are you going to take them and apply them to everybody else and never do the introspective thing and look inwardly? This is something Jesus is really wanting them to think about. Because the next thing that he tells them that's part of this discourse is he wants them to behave toward each other the way that God behaves toward them. He compares God to a good father who knows how to give bread to his children and doesn't give them things that are bad for them. He says, you know that. Certainly God knows that. Well, what's the takeaway of verses 7 through 12? Well, it's verse 12. In everything, therefore, if you understand how good God is, that he sends the rain on the just and the unjust in 7 and 4, 5 and 48. In everything, therefore, treat the people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law of the prophets. We call this, this is sort of like the doctrine of reciprocity. You may have heard certain commentators like Jordan Peterson talk about that. Basically, if the whole world lived like you lived, would it be a net positive for everyone? He says, treat people the way that you want God to treat you or them to treat you, and then you'll be doing the work of the kingdom. And he immediately says, look, not everybody's going to do this. And so you've got to enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are a few who find it. There's a lot of people. If your religion, your faith looks like everybody else's, and you're just going down the same road, talking about the same things they're talking about, being reassured by the same things they're reassured by, you're not really in fellowship with God. You're not walking the narrow way. The only way to know that you're walking the narrow way is to imitate him, like Jesus just mentioned in verse 12, to use righteous judgment in comparing ourselves to God's word. And then you get this idea, this last idea, where he's warning them about those who claim to be teachers of God that really aren't teaching truth. He says in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, not everybody who says I'm the Lord is going to enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. So not everybody who claims that Jesus is Lord is going to heaven. It's the one who does the will of the Father. And many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I don't know you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So the parable of the wise and the foolish builder is all about whether or not they are willing to take these sayings to heart and apply them and treat God as God, living according to his way, and Jesus as Lord in action and not just mouth service. Well, that's our 7 minutes. Hopefully we got to some of the deeper truths of this parable. Leave some comments here. Let me know what you thought. Did I miss anything that was an obvious connection? Maybe I'll take another pass at it. Or let me know what parable you'd like me to do next. I'd love it if you check out the whole series right over here. I'll put a link to this particular playlist. And be sure to like and share and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. We've been on fire lately, and I really want to keep that going. As always, I just want to tell you, have a good day, and God bless.